natural brook trout populations in our tributaries. So we have a topic a little different perhaps than the other lakes. Today I'm going to focus on some of the work that Fish and Wildlife Service and a number of our partners are doing in the Wisconsin's Lake Superior Basin in terms of our conservation and restoration efforts for brook trout. You see a number of folks that have contributed to this presentation listed on the bottom from our Fish and Wildlife Service office in Ashland, folks from Wisconsin DNR at the Superior and Ashland office, and then Anna Varian, who was with the Fish and Wildlife Service, is currently with Minnesota DNR. So some of the folks that helped with this presentation. Okay. So some of our objectives here were to implement a strategic approach for brook trout habitat conservation and restoration in the Lake Superior Basin. We wanted to utilize some available predictive models, both related to brook trout status and future stream temperature based on climate change models in the region. And then we wanted to utilize that information to help direct our habitat conservation and restoration efforts to some areas that we would identify as priorities for the Lake Superior Basin. We'll start with some information that we acquired through our status and distribution efforts. And you've seen some of this before, but we worked with partners across the Lake Superior Basin that had stream survey information. We're going to focus my talk today on the Wisconsin Basin, so the areas that you see dotted here in red. I'm not real thrilled with the graphics, but it should show up reasonably well in the center of the screen. So the slides that you'll see from here on out will be focused on the Wisconsin Basin. We do have the same information available for Michigan and Minnesota, and there's been some discussion with a number of partners about expanding this work beyond the Wisconsin region, but that hasn't taken place just yet. And when I say expand this work, I guess I mean expand the prioritization efforts. We have completed the status and distribution work throughout the basin. So we acquired about 2,000 data points throughout the basin. We placed those into the landscape within their catchments that they occurred. So these survey locations needed several key components to it. One, it needed to be geo-referenced. Two, we needed to have some length information with the fishery catch. So some of the data points were thrown out. Those that were available to utilize, we classified as surveys which either had self-sustaining brook trout, which meant there were multiple life stages of brook trout present, young a year, yearling, or age 2+. Some locations we had just individual life stages, so yearling, one of those 3 stages was present, but not multiple stages. And in other areas, there were no brook trout present. So those were our 3 categories. We utilized this information on a catchment basis. So you see the catchments delineated here by the black lines surrounding each of the colored sections. In general, a catchment is about a 3-kilometer square area. These were designated across the country by USGS and EPA. And they're available basically on a segment-by-segment basis, so a manageable unit to look at habitat restoration efforts. So this was our raw data that we had available. We then developed a model using the brook trout status as a dependent variable and looked at about 180 different predictor variables, boiled those down to 16 key variables that were available to help us predict brook trout status and distribution throughout the Lake Superior Basin in areas where we didn't have survey data or had incomplete information. And in the Wisconsin Basin, that product is shown here. So you see in the green shaded areas, locations where we had observed or actual survey data, and areas that our model predicted brook trout to be self-sustaining, so the multiple life stages. Areas that were either observed or predicted to have vulnerable or reduced brook trout populations, and in the gray and black areas that no brook trout were observed or predicted. The white areas that you see as not modeled are areas in which habitat is not suitable for brook trout. So intermittent tributaries, lake habitat, no surface water, areas that we wouldn't expect brook trout to be able to carry out their entire life cycle. So we scaled this. I've shown here a single sub-watershed with multiple catchments. So we scaled these individual catchments into their 12-digit HUC sub-watershed. In general, the 12-digit HUCs are about an 80 square kilometer unit of measure, and there are about 108 of these 12-digit HUCs throughout the northern or the Lake Superior Basin of Wisconsin. You'll see the survey data that we applied to the data points in order to classify each catchment as self-sustaining. And the darker shaded areas of each of the primary colors are again our observed survey information. The lighter colored areas are model predicted information. So we scaled this up to this 12-digit HUC unit of measure for the entire basin, and that's what you see here, our brook trout status distribution model for Wisconsin's Lake Superior Basin. So that was our basic summary of this brook trout status. Now I'm going to jump a bit to some of our climate change information. Many of you may have seen this before. This is a product that was done by the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts. Some of the predictions for future status of stream temperature information in Wisconsin and what that might mean for a variety of species. In this case, I selected information related to brook trout. And you see the left-hand image here of Wisconsin, current distribution of brook trout throughout the basin, and then a variety of scenarios that I'm going to go through based on increasing air temperature and resulting stream temperature increases. So you see here the best case scenario that was developed through this model was for a 1.1 degree increase in water temperature, and the predicted decrease in brook trout distribution across the state of about 45% under that future climate scenario. And if you look at a couple of other scenarios that were modeled, you see two different cases of a 2.5 degree Celsius increase as well as a 4 degree, and certainly the brook trout status in Wisconsin essentially collapses based on those future scenarios if they may occur in the state. There's also some additional information that was put together across the Great Lakes Basin for FishViz, and USGS was the primary author in this effort. Looked at current stream temperatures throughout the Lake Superior Basin. We've pulled those out on a stream-by-stream basis here. You see in dark blue those areas that are currently cold water, less than 17 degrees Celsius. Those in light blue, cold transition, the 17 to 19 degree range. Both of those we consider to be suitable for brook trout. And then warm transition and warm in the orange and yellow colors, which you see some of in the southeastern part of the basin. This FishViz effort that was led by USGS also predicted into the future, and we see here a 50-year projection into the future for what stream temperatures may look like based on several different climate change models that are available. And there's also a 100-year projection which continues this increase in red and orange sections, but I guess I felt that was a little less predictable, so we're going to stick to the 50-year projections and take a look at that. So what we currently had then is some information on brook trout status across the Wisconsin basin, as well as some predictions for future climate change. Completely unrelated, but benefiting this effort was a designation by the Department of Agriculture to select the Lake Superior Basin of Wisconsin as a priority watershed area for both the Natural Resource Conservation Service and the Forest Service, and that was described as the Wisconsin Lake Superior Landscape Restoration Partnership. That designation came with about $4 million to be able to use for habitat restoration purposes in the basin, and brook trout were identified as one of the species to focus on for that effort. So that stimulated us to put together a team of individuals from different partners, which cleverly we called the brook trout team, and as a group came up with this: how are we going to prioritize our conservation and habitat restoration efforts to put this $4 million+ to good use across the basin. And I should mention that that was designated for the Department of Ag agencies. Other agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Wisconsin DNR have additional habitat restoration monies, as do counties throughout the region. So it was something that we all wanted to look at as a group, is how do we do a better job prioritizing brook trout restoration efforts in the area. And the idea was to employ a strategic habitat conservation approach where we would use this biological information that we had from status and future climate change. We would try and develop some sort of a conservation design, which I'll describe to you just in a minute, on how we prioritize these efforts. And then our conservation delivery is essentially applying habitat restoration efforts on the ground and then looking at those applications to see have we made any improvement in brook trout abundance, status, distribution throughout the basin. So about this time we do a little check here. Let's see how everybody's doing. As a group, we described the 12-digit huck areas, or the 12-digit sub-watersheds. We're looking to prioritize the 105 watersheds in the Wisconsin basin to try and identify which areas might we want to focus. And so we used several different criteria. We used our brook trout status information, provided a 20-point scale here. Those areas that were self-sustaining received 20-point value. Those catchments that were modeled or observed to have a reduced brook trout status were given a 10-point, and those areas where brook trout were absent received no points. In terms of future temperatures, we provide a 20-point scale for cold water, 10 for cool transition, and 0 points for those warm and warm transition. And then we also looked at several management priorities. We figured that if agencies were already putting emphasis on certain habitats or areas, they were showing some prioritization internally. We looked at 3 or 4 criteria. We looked at whether there were specific regulations that protected brook trout or provided some advantage to brook trout in these waters. We looked at management plans, so the Lake Superior Landscape Management Plan, Wisconsin DNR plan, tribal conservation plans. We looked at the presence of non-native and native species throughout these areas, and we also looked at the presence of watershed associations, some societal value of where are private citizens actively involved across the basin. And that provided us a basis for scoring each catchment within a Huck 12. We took the average of those and came up with a score for each 12-digit Huck across the state. And you see those rankings here from 1 to 103 or 105 in the basin. From that, we selected our top 20 sub-watersheds and thought these were the areas that as a group we felt we wanted to focus our efforts of habitat restoration across the basin. So you should see these here in different shades. The dark green are our top 5 sub-watersheds, the second tier 6 through 10 in the light green, and then light blue and dark blue. So as a group, these are the areas that we're now proposing to put our habitat restoration dollars across the state of Wisconsin. And I'm going to take a little quicker look at a couple of these. The southwestern sub-watershed there, if you can read the upper Brule River just above the logos, and then Pikes Creek, which is located on the east side of the Bayfield Peninsula there, just west of Madeline Island. So we'll take a quick look at those two and how we might put this information to use. So the upper Brule River, in this map here we see brook trout status in each catchment across this sub-watershed. We also see the water temperature predictions into the future based on our color scheme there, dark blue, light blue, and orange. And then in lime green, you see the barriers or the stream crossings across that sub-watershed. So as we look at this information, the crossings, we seem to have brook trout present throughout this entire sub-watershed. No evidence of of lack of populations throughout the region. We do want to take a closer look at some of these road crossings, make sure there aren't any barriers, perched culverts, something like that, acting as a barrier to fish passage. There is the area in the southwestern part of this basin that shows some potential for warm transition water into the future. That's an area to take a look at and see if there's any application that we can do for habitat restoration efforts, meaning narrowing channel, perhaps planting trees to help shade the stream, something that might be help us alleviate the potential for warm transition to be present in this area in the future. But in general, as our highest rated sub-watershed, it looks like it's in very good shape. Perhaps not a lot to do there, but provide protection, which Wisconsin DNR is already doing. And then let's move on and see if there are habitat restoration efforts needed in another sub-watershed. This is the Pikes Creek sub-watershed, also one of our top rated 12-digit hucks. I guess all of these are. They're in our top 20. But you see the status and road crossings in this area as well. And one of the things that jumps out here to us is the glaciated area, an area that brook trout were observed to be absent. You look upstream of that, or just to the north, you'll see that brook trout were modeled to be self-sustaining in that area. We obviously don't know if that's the true value or not, but so one of the things we want to take a look at is the road crossing at the southern end of that gray or absent catchment. See if there's likely a road culvert or some sort of crossing issue there that is preventing brook trout from accessing the habitat upriver in Pikes Creek. So it gives us some way to kind of start to take a look at these areas. This is just something you can do in the office without any kind of field work or field visit, and get some idea of where might we want to take a look further for some potential restoration action as we move forward. Along with this, there's the funding opportunities that came with the various agencies that I mentioned. NRCS, their EQIP program, environmental quality incentives. Fish and Wildlife Service has a number of programs that we're able to utilize. Our partners for Fish and Wildlife, which we can work with private landowners, the National Fish Passage Program, and our Coastal Habitat and Species Funds. Wisconsin DNR has their Managed Forest Law and Forest Landowner Grant Program, and the Forest Service, in addition to working within their forests, has the Good Neighbor Funds, which can be utilized on private lands to help restore habitat. And some of the different applications that we might utilize there, tree and shrub planting to increase shade cover, try and slow the flow a bit from these areas to improve and reduce the amount of temperature increase in the river and sedimentation coming into the river. Stream bank protection efforts, these are pretty common and standard application, but they're available to the agencies that are working in this area as potential habitat restoration actions. And you see here with the NRCS, they actually put some value to each of these for their particular grants. Fish and Wildlife Service, some of our in-stream habitat work, introduction of large wood debris to try and create some structure to the channel, deeper pools, exposing gravel. And then I think about every agency has some sort of fish passage or culvert replacement program in place. So we'll start with these top 20 watersheds. We want to be opportunistic because you're not always sure what county, what agency, what organization might have money available. But these are the areas that we're looking to focus our resources into the short-term future. And these are the individuals who helped contribute to this effort. And one last thing I want to mention is that along with the funding that came through the Department of Agriculture was an outreach campaign. So we provided mailings to private landowners within each of those 20 priority sub-watersheds, informing them that there are funding available for habitat restoration projects. Essentially, they identify one of our regional conservancy agencies, and they work with our technicians from the different fishery agencies to identify and conduct site visits to identify actual habitat restoration projects on the ground. With that, I can take any questions.